We hear often the opposite narrative that China is, of course, a demon, that it creates huge trouble in this neighborhood, is out to destabilize the neighborhood, contain India, create debt traps for different neighboring countries. So you can see China showing up in many new spaces, in new sectors, with new partners and players that are its allies across the neighborhood. China is certainly looking at this from a larger perspective of India-China relations that have not necessarily been good, as you know, over the last few years, and therefore by showing up in Nepal and doing things in the Maldives, it often, but not always, has India as an objective in order to protect its own interests, its economic interests, its security stakes in these countries. China is developing inroads into these countries that create issues in border areas with India. And let's not forget that China has a history of decades of supporting anti-India insurgent groups through Bangladesh, through Myanmar. Chinese sometimes economic engagements with these countries have led to biased economic choices by these countries and crises. Where in response to those crises, it was only India that showed up. So denial and delivery have to be constantly used in tandem and in balance in India's neighborhood policy. China will never be able to do whether the productive or destructive effect that India can do to their country. India is becoming a top world economy, trading more, investing more, in companies going out. These linkages are being revived with its neighboring countries. We have many also very sensible, mature leaders in the region that understand that they have to work with India. Not always, but they have to find solutions towards economic connectivity of India. It's a boxing match, that's the best picture, with multiple never-ending rounds. And not only between India and China, between many different players. So finally, many things that we dreamt about for a long time in India's neighborhood policy are happening to the benefit of India, to the benefit of India's neighboring states, and to the benefit, I think, of the world.
Hello and welcome back to the HD podcast. I'm your host Shashank Mattoo, reporting from Washington, D.C. Over the last couple of decades, there has been really one question that has worried India's foreign policy makers, which is China and its influence in South Asia. Over the last 20 years, we've seen China establish its relationships with not just old allies like Pakistan, but also with countries that India considers friends and strategic partners in the neighborhood, like Nepal, Myanmar, Bangladesh, and also increasingly in countries like Bhutan. Now, the big question, of course, is where that influence is. And that influence extends across defense, economics, civil society, and media. And a new report by the Center for Social and Economic Progress, or CSEP, a think tank based in Delhi, looks exactly at the influence that China has managed to establish in South Asia. And today we're joined by the man who held the CSEP and has played a major role in tracking India's neighborhood, but also China's influence there, is Dr. Constantino Xavier. Dr. Xavier, thank you so much for joining us on the HT podcast. Could you begin by telling us what you saw in the course of this report? You've also written a little bit about how China looks at South Asia, looks at India's neighborhood. Could you begin by explaining to us what we've seen over the last 20 years in terms of China's expanding influence in what has often been called India's strategic backyard?
Thanks, Shashank. Good to chat with you. This report that I edited together with Professor Jabin Jacob from Shivnada University, who works with us at CSEP, is part of an attempt to do what you are laying out, which is, we hear two great narratives all the time, Shashank. One that glorifies China and South Asia, that this is going to be the source of all solutions in this neighborhood, whether between India and Pakistan or for the development of Nepal or Sri Lanka. We hear often the opposite narrative that China is, of course, a demon, that it creates huge trouble in this neighborhood, is out to destabilize the neighborhood, contain India, create debt traps for different neighboring countries like Sri Lanka, etc. So I think the truth is somewhere in the middle in our report. This one and the previous one that we've published over the last 2 years, this one is, of course, fresh off the press, has 20 case studies from scholars across the regions who are telling us the story as it is. They're mapping not only what China is doing, but most importantly, how China is playing across these neighboring countries a growing role. That is an economic role, it's a political role, it's a defense and security role, it's a role on health, education, governance of infrastructure. So you can see China showing up in many new spaces, in new sectors with new partners and players that are its allies across the neighborhood.
Now, Dr. Xavier, something that you point out that's very interesting in these reports is, of course, number one, cases like where Bangladesh has become one of the largest importers of Chinese arms and equipment. China is one of the largest investors now in the region. There's a case study that I found particularly fascinating about Nepal and China, of course, building infrastructure in border regions, of course, because Nepal also shares a border with Tibet. A very interesting set of case studies, which all brings us to one question, which is what exactly does China want for all of this investment in South Asia? Is it just economic influence? Is it trying to, as is often said, undercutting India's influence in South Asia? What exactly is going on? What does China want?
A very difficult question, Shashank, to understand and decipher what China wants. In a separate study, by the way, that is about to be released, we analyze over 500 speeches from Chinese officials across the government and ministries on South Asia to exactly understand whether what they tell us in public is an indicator of what they're thinking, which is not always the same. But let me try to answer your question of what we have learned through these case studies from these scholars. I think one natural factor, Shashank, is that China is just a growing economic player today. So it will show up in different regions and in different countries, including in South Asia, where it was traditionally less present. So, as a function of Chinese companies seeking energy access, opportunities to invest, opportunities to trade and create new supply chains. The Chinese military, which is increasing its number of joint exercises beyond its traditional neighborhood. So there is, first of all, just a natural outgoing China that is also showing up in India's traditional periphery. A second reason is what we call the pull factor. Let us not forget that often it is the countries in South Asia, leaders and governments and different parties. In the case of Nepal, as one of our case studies shows, for example, subnational even units, sort of federal and regional states, that are pulling China into these countries. They demand more from China. They want more finance, more support, more governance lessons and comparative experiences from China. Sometimes also to bargain with India to say, look, the Chinese are providing us with something. Why don't you top up your offer, your engagement, your level of support to our country? But that's a second factor, which is a pull factor. Finally, the third factor is maybe the one you mentioned, of course, that India figures in all of Chinese calculations. Whatever China does in Afghanistan, in Myanmar, in Nepal, in Sri Lanka, and the Maldives is part of a larger strategy. And yes, maybe not to undercut China, but undercut India, sorry, but certainly to, you know, create more space, sometimes complementary to India, sometimes at the expense of India. So China is certainly looking at this from a larger perspective of India-China relations that have not necessarily been good, as you know, over the last few years. And therefore, by showing up in Nepal and doing things in the Maldives, it often, but not always, has India as an objective in order to protect its own interests, its economic interests, its security stakes in these countries.
Right. Dr. Xavier, I have to let me ask you a little bit about that question of, is this happening? Is China's rising influence really a detriment to India's interest? Because we saw just while over the last couple of weeks, all the focus is on Prime Minister Modi's visit to China. We also saw that China was helping host a trilateral with Bangladesh and Pakistan, which is again something that India doesn't very much like to see. We've seen for example, in Sri Lanka, when India has raised the question of Tamil minority rights. China has often, within the context of Sri Lankan politics, basically said that, look, this is interference in your domestic politics. We've seen that really play out in a number of sectors. And therefore, the question that a lot of people tracking China's rising influence in South Asia will say, well, China has often used that influence, most notably in the case of Pakistan, of course, to sort of act in ways that India does not want to see. So, if I could ask you a bit more about that question, or perhaps if you could channel some of the concerns that India has had about China, what are those concerns?
I mean, from India's perspective, there are three buckets, if you want. Bucket one is Chinese activities that do not hinder Indian interests, right? I mean, in fact, can even benefit Indian interests. I remember Indian officials up to 2016, 17, 18 inviting Chinese investments into the northeast region of India, something that we forgot about and think is a highly, deeply sensitive issue these days, probably. But there is certainly bucket one issues where China can work in Bangladesh and Sri Lanka and Nepal and actually support the modernization of those economies, create opportunities in those countries that will also benefit Indian companies and India's growth and regional prospects. Bucket two are things that India will tolerate or coexist with. China being the principal weapons exporter to the Bangladesh military forces since the 1990s has not created always huge problems from India. India has lived with that in the 90s and the 2000s, tolerated it or even accepted it, and moved on and done, and is doing now, for example, the first Indian line of credit for defense items was approved for Bangladesh a few years ago. And therefore, India is now trying to also do its own defense diplomacy and outreach, etc. The third bucket are things that are detrimental to Indian interests. They are core security interests. That means that China is developing inroads into these countries that create issues in border areas with India. And let's not forget that China has a history of decades of supporting anti-India insurgent groups through Bangladesh, through Myanmar in the past. So there's a history of sensitivity there, obviously. This means China investing at the detriment of Indian companies that lose out, right, to important contracts, important investment opportunities because the Chinese are more nimble, and therefore pose a challenge to Indian companies that are seeking to connect through trade investments with its neighboring countries. And finally, also military and security issues, right? I mean, let's look at a concept, for example, that in banking is very popular, Shashank, which is moral hazard, right? I mean, maybe China didn't create debt traps. I mean, that we can discuss. But certainly, Chinese sometimes economic engagements with these countries have led to biased economic choices by these countries and crises. Where, in response to those crises, it was only India that showed up. In Sri Lanka, for example, that it was India that massively had to respond to stabilize the economy of Sri Lanka and the Maldives. In Bangladesh, not yet, but maybe in the future. And Nepal, not yet, but I expect in the next 6 to 12 months, again, a dire financial situation in Nepal, where India will be in the front, expected to support those countries. So, in that sense, I think what China does in these countries has natural first order implications for Indian economic and security interests.
Right. Could I also ask you something that's very interesting? One of the case studies that we saw, and you speak to folks in Nepal, as I'm sure you have, and this often raises their hackles quite a bit, which is the case of the Pokhara International Airport. It was, of course, built with Chinese investment, and a key area of tension between India and Nepal these days is that India has not allowed airlines under its control to operate and go to Pokhara International Airport. And this was seen as one of those cases of India being dubious of China's influence in countries like Nepal and of its investment in those parts of the world, and a symbol perhaps of New Delhi's concerns about China's influence. Could you comment on that a little bit?
Yeah, it's something I tend to call the policy of denial, Shashank, right? It is a red line you draw, and it is something that you don't want to use too many times, because the more you use it, it will be resented, it will be taken less seriously, right? So something that you may have heard, Shank, regularly is that some core security interest of India is affected by Chinese investment in Sri Lanka, for example, in the maritime domain or in the energy sector. Or in the case of Bangladesh, we saw an example of a Chinese investment into civilian airport infrastructure that was deemed a concern from India. I like to unpack these, and I think it's very important for an effective neighborhood policy for India to be very sure when these security interests are truly interests and core and when not, right? Because neighboring countries will expect that from India, right? Of course, they sometimes use it excuses because you want to deter Chinese investments and you want Indian companies to bag these contracts and opportunities. But I mean, in that game, we all know that game. So I think that there's a policy of denial that India must use. It is a country that is centrally located and has economic and security interests in the periphery. That's what regional powers do. That's what Russia does. That's what China does in its respective peripheries. But at the same time, you don't want to overuse the policy of denial without incrementing the policy of delivery, right? The opportunities you're giving these countries, saying, here's a solution that is alternative, that is better, more cost effective, and more in line with your interests compared to what, say, China is offering. So denial and delivery have to be constantly used in tandem and in balance in India's neighborhood policy.
So, Dr. Xavier, one thing I wanted to ask you about was China's image in South Asia. And really, what the report brought home to me is that, in fact, many countries in the neighborhood have a fairly positive view of China. They respect China's economic development and its growth journey. Many of them actually quite like the fact that China doesn't interfere in their politics as much as they think India does. Could you comment a little bit on that about China's image, especially given the fact that, over the last couple of years, India has tried to raise that question of tetrap diplomacy, what's happened in Hambantota, what's happened on the India-China relationship, what's happened on the Bhutan-China border. There are also all those questions. But the sense I got was that actually China's image remains reasonably positive in the neighborhood.
Yes, 3 points on this. One, there's a huge gap between the perception of China right here in India and what we learned from the scholars that contributed from across the region. We have scholars from Afghanistan, even from Myanmar, that tell us a story that tends to be rather more benign and positive about China as an alternative, as an important development player for these countries. Second, however, in my travels and engagements with decision makers, I think they tend to be quite realistic about what India can and cannot offer and what China can and cannot offer. Often they understand that if you're sitting in Nepal or in Sri Lanka, that you have to live with India. You have to coexist and make the best out of India that is growing, is becoming a major economic global player. Um, so the idea is that you have to live with India, but you don't necessarily like it. It's difficult. It is also difficult to sell India domestically. It is a next door power. There are histories of political and ethnic and religious linkages that come into the play, etc. On the other hand, with China, I think there's a sort of a mesmerization with China, an idea that China is an important player that they would like to get closer to. But at the same time, rather realistically, I think there's an understanding that China will never be able to do whether the productive or destructive effect that India can do to their countries, right? So there's almost an umbilical cord with India that needs to be managed. It's an irritant sometimes, but I don't think there's any decision maker in Nepal, in Bangladesh, or Sri Lanka that realizes that ignores the importance of India as an economic player to their future developmental and growth paths.
Right. Could you tell me a little bit about that? Because we said we'd get down to it. So this is, I suppose, our opportunity to talk about how India has responded to the China challenge in its neighborhood. Have you seen any major changes in terms of how India approaches the neighborhood? Because it understands, as you were saying, that China has emerged as an alternative suitor to the region to come in, offer loans, investments, development, military arms, and equipment. How has that sort of changed India's foreign policy towards the neighborhood? Has it disciplined it? Has it changed it in other ways? What do you think?
I mean, similar to China, I think the first factor within India's neighborhood policy is not necessarily China. It is just India growing. It is India connecting with its neighboring countries after decades of stagnation, insulation, partitions in this region. So naturally, as India is becoming a top world economy, trading more, investing more, Indian companies going out, these linkages are being revived with its neighboring countries. Now, yes, the China factor comes in second and is an important accelerator, which means that as a function of China through the Belt and Road Initiative, investing in these countries, trading with these countries, developing political linkages with the elites in these countries, engaging research universities, think tanks, journalists, subnational provinces, beyond the capitals, playing a very nimble diplomatic game also. I see India also under pressure to top up its own game, right? And to do more on what I mentioned before, the policy of delivery, right? And that is a competitive game, which actually is a good game. It's a great game. It's pushed India to rethink how to engage with these countries. It has focused the neighborhood first policy. It has led to important institutional changes even here at home. We see the government of India and Delhi today working in tandem more and more with states to connect with its neighboring countries, say Tamil Nadu with Sri Lanka on a land bridge, with the state of Uttar Pradesh and UP towards UP and Bihar towards Nepal. Um, Tripura, a state you wouldn't think of when you think of India's foreign policy, is today an important player in the connectivity policies with Bangladesh, with its railways and trade. So it's pushed India to do more, better, and faster. And that's why I say often the India China competition is actually quite healthy, both for India and for China, but particularly for neighboring countries that are the heart of this competition.
Right. Dr. Xavier, I have to ask you because, in the popular media sometimes, I remember, for example, covering the Bhutan China border talks, which had, of course, been going off and on for decades. And there was this popular outpouring of, shall I say, sometimes resentment, even betrayal. That was the word used by a number of media organizations, saying that, oh, look at this, the Bhutanese, our steadfast friends and allies, are now dealing with the Chinese, and this is a major problem for us in many ways. And this was very much the narrative that sometimes pops up of resentment, perhaps betrayal, when countries in the neighborhood that we see as traditional friends are engaging with China. So, to an Indian audience, how do you explain that sense? What really is the view when India sees these, or really what is the right view? Because I remember you were also saying that India has to decide what is really a threat to its interests and what is really investment that these countries desperately need. So, could you speak a little bit about that, about those feelings of resentment sometimes, but also about what India logically, rationally, maturely needs to do to understand about China's role in the region now?
I think we have to look at this a little less dispassionately. To your point about resentment, I think the decision makers I speak to in a government, in industry, are looking at this from a very rational perspective. And basically, this is an open, competitive field now. It's an open market. There is no exclusive, predominant region anymore. Forget the Chinese. We have today multilateral development banks like the AIIB, the NDB, active in this region. We have Japan as an important player in Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. We have the Americans still involved across the region and opening up new missions. We have Australia, for example, which opened up a diplomatic mission in the Maldives. The Europeans are showing up. The European Investment Bank is very interested in developing connectivity in the region and investing in regional integration. So this is a very open field where every day decision makers will have to take different choices and weigh the pros and cons of choices of doing something with China, with Japan, with India, etc. And therefore, I think the politics of emotion will be there. But at the same time, I see India responding with some maturity. For example, Shashank, you mentioned Bhutan, but when Bhutan decided that it did not want to join a hard negotiated motor vehicles agreement together with Nepal and India, and Bangladesh. I think India had the mature decision in realizing that tiny Bhutan, at what 7 or 8 lakhs population, smaller than many districts in India, was concerned about massive inflow of Indian tourist vehicles, taxis, trucks, etc. And India had the maturity to say, okay, we'll wait for the moment when you feel confident enough on your terms to plug in into a motor mobility agreement with this huge country that we are, India. So there'll be many speeds of engagement, many sensitivities from the smaller countries. I think growing sensibility from India and tact in knowing when to push, when not to push, and as we mentioned before, also to say these are things that are non-negotiable. As a realist, forgive me, but I think there are states that play international politics by communicating directly in a friendly and courteous manner that this hurts our immediate interest, explain exactly how, and then impose your veto or, of course, impose some coercive power if you have. That is a game that is going to be played differently with Nepal, with Sri Lanka, with Bhutan, etc. And the key difference, only Shashank, I think, is that there are different leaders in these neighboring countries that understand this. There are leaders that will push against India because it buys them another 6 months or 1 year in power or another election, but they will sacrifice the relationship with India. And I think we have many also very sensible, mature leaders in the region that understand that they have to work with India, not always, but they have to find solutions towards economic connectivity with India. Sheikh Hasina was such a leader. I think the current president of Sri Lanka is such a leader. I think President Moizu in the Maldives, after a difficult start, has proven to be that leader. I think former Prime Minister Oli Nepal was not that leader, and let's see which direction the new leadership in Nepal will take this, but I'm optimistic that they will take us toward a pragmatic engagement with India.
Right. Dr. Sevi, let me ask you then two questions to close out. You've studied India's engagement in the neighborhood very closely. You've, of course, now also seen how China's engaging with the neighborhood. Could you perhaps lay out for us what are, let's say, India's strengths and weaknesses and China's strengths and weaknesses? What do the two sides do? What does India do relatively better relative to China, and what does China do better relative to India?
Oh, tough one, Shashank. I think let's start with the Chinese side and what we have learned. I think the Chinese have the greatest trouble at dealing with political pluralism of South Asia. This is a messy political affair in these countries, right? I mean, Nepal has had 17 prime ministers in 20 years. There are factions within parties, right? There are now protest movements that have toppled regimes in Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and Nepal. There's a constant political churning that is a reflection of the deep diversity, and I think political diversity in this region. So that's a weakness for the Chinese, and they're still puzzled often and really confused by this, right? I think one strength of the Chinese is that they adapt very, very quickly. In fact, one of the arguments we make in our report is there's much that India can learn from Chinese diplomacy. They reach out, they learn, they reassess, they engage new actors, they invest in their own capacity to speak local languages, to court new groups beyond the traditional groups that run affairs in these countries. So it's a modular, flexible China that adapts, learns, and improves. And there, I'd say to start on the Indian weakness, we have an rather outdated system that is now trying to adapt to the new circumstances. Therefore, competition is good, as I was saying before. But the Indian system is still sort of designed, as it was for decades, to predominate, to exist in this region, to be consulted first, sit on things, fester sometimes, deny, etc. So that's a weakness. I'd say a strength on the Indian system is that it is a system that is very similar to its neighboring country systems. So I think if you are a decision maker in Bangladesh or Nepal today and you're looking at developing governance solutions, you will look generally with more interest to what India has done. For example, the digital public infrastructure sphere, than what China has done under a one party state. I think most decision makers in this diverse South Asia realize that under broadly democratic conditions, it's very difficult to replicate whatever we call the Xi Jinping thought and its governance mechanism, which is built on a strong one party state where there is no space for dissent and decentralized thinking.
Understood. Let me ask you one final question then, Dr. Xavier. There is often this sense, I think, because of what has happened in the neighborhood over the last couple of years, the relationship with China and Pakistan has been strained. As you know, there has been, of course, what's just happened in Nepal. The relationship with Bangladesh has taken some knocks over the last year. Sri Lanka, of course, there were lots of questions after the election of the new government. And of course, Maldives as well, what happened earlier in 2024 in terms of the diplomatic bust up between India and the Maldives. There's been that sort of sense of the neighborhood being, unstable, of India's influence being more uncertain. And of course, this rising question of China and China's rising influence in these parts of the world, which sometimes can seem gargantuan when you talk to some scholars in the neighborhood. At the same time, India is also pushing to connect the region more, have more pipelines, have more roads, have more rail links connecting themselves, connecting India's economy to these neighborhoods. So, what is the picture exactly? Is it in terms of the effectiveness of India's neighborhood policy and the challenge posed by China? Your view?
It's a boxing match. That's the best picture with multiple never ending rounds. And not only between India and China, between many different players. And as you know, boxers tend to hit each other in the face, but they also are deeply respectful of each other and often partners and allies. So I think that's the long picture. It is going to be a massive transformation of this region, Shashank. We're talking about one fourth of humanity living in and around India. We are seeing a massive political churning in this region with young, restless, increasingly unemployed populations. We are seeing systems that are open, but that also have the lure of authoritarianism and political centralization. We saw, for example, the figure of the king of Nepal emerging as a possible solution in Nepal. So that is also there. It's a massive churning because there are very difficult global economic circumstances. So there's an economic slowdown that is affecting this region. And you have very young populations, extremely young populations. Like in Nepal, median age 25. So within that, I think we will have to think very imaginatively about this region. I think India has begun to do that. As you mentioned, it has developed linkages that we could only dream of. For example, Nepal having a hydropower that is finally actualized and is actually selling power to Bangladesh, including last year after the Bangladesh crisis, something that India facilitated and supported. So finally, many things that we dreamt about for a long time in India's neighborhood policy are happening to the benefit of India, to the benefit of India's neighboring states, and to the benefit, I think, of the world. Because if this region remains stable and a zone of growth, I think anyone in the surrounding regions, whether it's China, whether it's the Gulf, whether it is Southeast Asia and the rest of the world, should see that as good news and should be actively involved in supporting India and China or other players, but particularly India as the central power in this region, to facilitate that economic, political stabilization of what we generally call South Asia.
Understood. Dr. Constantino Xavier, I have to say that boxing match is, I think, the analogy I think that will stay in my head of two competitors staying respectful, but still, of course, both of them wanting to win that fight, coming back round after round, learning from each other, and hopefully improving just outcomes for everyone in South Asia. Dr. Xavier, thank you so much for joining us here on HT Podcast.
Thank you, Shashank.